Hey folks, Glenn May here with BassResource.com, and today I want to talk to you about a question that I get fairly often, and that is if you're in a brand new body of water, how do you go about finding fish and what lures do you use? So I want to talk about, since it's fall, I want to talk about specifically how do you find fish on a brand new body of water during the fall and what lures to use. So I want to talk, first of all, before I get into lures, I want to talk about my approach. When it comes to fall fishing, brand new lake, as soon as I launch the boat, one of the first things I do is I beeline it right to the first point, the nearest point I can find. Now the reason for that is all throughout the summer, spring, and into fall, tournaments are being held, and typically the weigh-ins are right there at the ramp, and a lot of people release their fish right there. Well, the closest structure is that point, so I'll go right to it. And a lot of fish will go there, they'll set up shop for a little while, and then they'll disperse throughout the rest of the lake. And some of them will stay there. But these are fish that have already been caught, which means they have a propensity to bite. So the nearest point by a launch can be very productive. A lot of people blow right on by it because it's too close to the launch and they think it gets overfished. Oftentimes it's not. So that's the first thing I'll do. A brand new lake I haven't been to, I'm going to find a point. And the thing I want to do is I want to figure out what depth they're at and what's their disposition. And I kind of think about with the fall, there's this migration that happens. So I think about what period in the fall are you at. In the early fall, the fish will start to move shallow, chasing bait fish and feeding up heavy for getting ready for the winter. So the bulk of the population is going to be in that 1 to 10 foot range. Whereas you get late in the fall, these fish will be moving out deeper. So now they'll be deeper than 10 feet, 10 to 25 feet, especially as you get closer to winter, they're going to be deeper, closer to that 25-foot zone. So I'll hit that point relative to where we are in the season. If it's early on in the fall, I'm going to start off shallow and fish deep, whereas if it's mid to late fall, I'm going to start deep and work my way up shallower to try to figure out what depth those fish are holding at. And I'm attacking with several different lures with different approaches and speeds to figure out what their disposition is. Another thing I take into consideration is the fronts. During the early fall, fronts don't have so much of an impact on the bass, but later on in the fall, you usually have larger fronts, and a big front that blows through has a chance of shutting down the bite, or at least making them sink a little bit lower, a little bit deeper, and hugging that cover a little bit more. So you got to think about what lures to use if the fish may be doing that. So with that in mind, let's get into the 5 lures that I use, starting with the Yum Dinger. I really like using the Yum Dinger. Some people like to use a Senko. I like to use a Yum Dinger because it's more durable. But I like it because it's so flexible. You can use it in a variety of different conditions and different depths. Early in the fall, when the fish are shallow, I just simply rig it weightless and throw it out there and at any kind of cover that they may be at. It could be docks, could be rocks, could be logs, any kind of flats where there's grass, any place where they could be chasing those bait fish. That's where I want to throw that Yum Dinger, and just throw it out and let it fall in slack line so it falls horizontally. And a lot of times that's how you get bit, is that presentation. That's all there is to it. You don't have to do anything else, really. It's an easy bait to use, although I like to skip it under docks, especially in the early fall and into mid-fall when the fish are up shallow. You can get back in there where those fish are and put it right on their face. So that could be a lot of fun. But as fall progresses and the fish start to move deeper, now I can rig it on a drop shot or a split shot or even a Carolina rig to get that bait down there and still get to those fish with a Yum Dinger and get those bites to continue on throughout the fall. And you can fish it at any kind of speed with those rigs. You can, with a drop shot, you can just let it sit there in place, or you can jig it just a little bit to give it a little bit of action, just let it sit in place. You can also drag it just a little bit and move it. With the split shot, what I like to do is I like to lift it up a little bit, pull it in and let it drop. What it does is the weight comes up, it brings that Yum Dinger up behind it, the weight drops, and then the Yum Dinger does that fall. And that's usually how you get that bite. So you still have that action, but now you're in 15 or 20 feet of water. You don't have to wait for it to get down there. Just use a split shot to get it down there, and then you can work it that way. So really good versatile lure to use. You can cover the whole water column and the different speeds throughout the fall. Now the next lure I like to use is very similar reasons, is the jig. The jig again can be fished at all depths and at different speeds. Early in the fall, I'll use a 3/8 ounce jig, and I'm going to throw it around all that kind of cover that I just mentioned. I love to throw it next to docks, a 3/8 ounce jig, just let it slowly fall next to it. Along weed lines, these fish will get up into weeds, and I find that weed line, that edge, and drop it right along that edge. And those fish that are cruising the edge looking for bait fish will snatch it up before it hits the bottom. As fall progresses and they start to get deeper, I'll still use a 3/8 ounce jig. It works really well in those deeper weed beds, and especially where there's any kind of rocks or logs along them. But I'll also get a little bit heavier too when the wind picks up, so it can maintain contact. It's kind of hard to maintain contact with a 3/8 ounce jig in 20 feet of water when the wind's blowing. So if it gets a little bit strong out there, I'll use it 1/2 ounce, maybe a 3/4 ounce, and I'll flip over to a football head jig as it gets down away from the weeds. Late in the fall, when they're just in the structure and there's not a lot of weeds on them, a football head jig works really well, like over the tops of humps or in the middle of creek channels or those drop-offs or deep points. Let it fall, get to the bottom, and then slowly work it, slowly. And what happens with that football head jig is you pull it through on the bottom, it wobbles back and forth. It looks like a little crawdad just making its way along. Very vulnerable, lonely, unsuspecting crawdad. Bass can't resist that. So it's a great way to fish the different depths. And also, when the fish you've got these big fronts that have come through and they're not willing to bite so much, a jig is a really good bait to use. So, use a jig. Definitely use that. Now, my next bait that I really like to use during the fall, and depending on what, again, lake I'm on, but usually a 6-inch Paddletail Swimbait works really well because the fish are gorging on bait fish. So it's a great time to use it during the fall. And I use it kind of as a search bait when I'm trying to find fish. You can fish it up shallow, and you can run it through any kind of cover, any kind of depth, using just a 1/4 ounce keel weighted hook, Texas rig it, and now I can throw it into anything and not worry about getting it hung up. But along docks works really well. You can bring along those weed edges and just kill it and let it flutter down. There's a lot of different ways you can fish it, and especially as it gets deeper into the fall, I just add the weight of it. I'll put a 3/8 ounce weight onto it, maybe 1/2 ounce as it gets deeper and deeper, and I can still work it the same way. And those fish that are focusing on bait fish will clock it. One little tip, it's a great way to fish suspending fish. That is, when you've got schools of bait fish, especially in the late part of the fall, when perch will be in big balls. Shad will do this too sometimes. They'll be kind of off, maybe offshore a bit, maybe hanging out over 40, 50 feet of water. But they'll be within 10 feet or so, 15 feet of the surface. If you look on your depth finder and you see that there's a nice tight ball, then that means they're protecting, they're being herded or attacked by prey fish, typically bass. If it's a big loose ball, then there usually aren't any bass nearby. So pay attention how tight that ball is. It's nice and tight. I'll take that Paddletail Swimbait, 1/4 ounce, even though I'm in deep water, and I want to throw it right over the top of that bait fish ball and just let it fall right through it. When it comes out near the bottom, it looks like a bait fish that's dying, and that's what the bass are keying on, and pow! It's a great way to catch bass. Now, if you're throwing in perch, it may be a little difficult because perch love plastics. So they may nip and fight and bite it a little bit, so you may have to resist setting the hook until you really feel that good weight on it that it's a bass, and then set the hook. But great way to fish balls of fish, bait fish in the late fall. Now, I'd be remiss to go to a brand new lake during the fall if I didn't have a spinnerbait tied on. Because a spinnerbait to me is really a great lure to use during the fall because it mimics bait fish, which is exactly what the fish are keying on. Not only that though, spinnerbaits can be fished in all depths of water and different speeds. So in the early fall, when the fish are up shallow, I'll use a 3/8 ounce spinnerbait with a willow leaf blade because it gives off the profile and flash of bait fish. And again, I'll throw it around anything that I can see, visible cover. Weeds, docks, rocks, logs, chunk rock, big flats. Those are the things that those fish are keying on during this time of year. Then you get into mid to late fall and these fish start to pull off in those deeper weed beds. That's when I'll heavy up a little bit, go to 1/2 ounce and later on even a 3/4 ounce, put on maybe Colorado blades so I can get it down there and work it a bit slower right along those weed edges or the tops of those deep weed beds. Those humps can be really good this time of year. And also when the fish, sometimes when in the late fall, you got a big front that comes through, and they tend to hunker down in the middle of those creek channels. It's a great time to drag and slow roll a 3/4 ounce spinnerbait through them and catch them that way. And even when they get deep, you can let it flutter down, helicopter down right to the base of a point or base of a hump and work it nice and slow, pump it up and down through that way and let it flutter again. Those fish tend to be keen on dying bait fish, so bringing it up and let it fall back down, that pumping action resembles a bait fish that's struggling to stay upright. Great way to catch fish in the fall. So spinnerbait, you definitely got to have tied on. And finally, my fifth bait, not last or least, but it just happens to be last of the list, is a frog. Now, a frog, admittedly, isn't as good to use later in the fall when the fish are deeper. But, boy, in early to mid-frog season, early to mid-fall season, I can almost call it a frog season, because that, to me, is like the best time to be throwing a frog throughout the entire year. Bar none. Even during the summer and in the spring when frogs work really well, topwater frog action in the fall there's none other like it. It is a blast, and you've got to have a frog tied on. Now, you can fish it a variety of ways. If the fish are very active, you can walk the dog and cause quite a bit of commotion. I like to plop it along really quick, just fast cadence, just real quick, plop, 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 and make a lot of noise and sputter it along and get a lot of fish's attention that way. I bring it over the tops of those weeds, right next to those logs, and then right alongside docks. Great way to go after those aggressive fish, and the strikes are ferocious. But even as you move a little bit more towards mid-fall, those fish are going to get more into those weeds and those weed beds, and you can bring it over the tops of those weeds without worrying about it getting hung up. And you can slow it down, so you can work it a lot more methodically. The fish may be a little more reluctant to rise to a topwater bait, but if you can make it look like something that's struggling on the surface, because a frog floats, and you can sit there in place and just barely pop it and barely move it, make it look like something that's struggling, those fish will rise up and hit it that way. So it can be very, very effective, and a real fun way to catch fish is using frogs during the fall, especially in a new body of water. You feel like you just triumphed. It could be a great way to find all those fish. So those are my top fish finders in the fall. I hope that works. For more tips and tricks like that, visit BassResource.com.